Imagine being born king of one of the world's greatest empires, and dying just 5 days later. This is the most bizarre and darkest story of the French monarchy, a mystery that has remained unanswered for over 700 years. We are talking about John I, the posthumous, the only king of France who should never have been forgotten, but whom history has practically erased. And the more details you learn about this story, the more disturbing it becomes. The death of this baby wasn't just a tragedy. It was possibly the first major political assassination that completely changed the course of European history. Stay until the end, because what happened to this child king will leave you speechless. To understand this story, we need to go back to the year 1316. France was in total crisis. King Louis XI had just died suddenly, leaving only a 5-year-old daughter and a pregnant wife. For the first time in 329 years, since the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, there was no obvious male heir to the throne. Louis's brother, Philip, assumed the role of regent, awaiting the birth of the baby who could resolve everything. The tension was unbearable because if a boy was born, he would be king. But if a girl was born, the succession would be complete chaos. The entire kingdom held its breath, awaiting that birth. The French nobles were divided, plotting behind the scenes. The absolute power of France was at stake, and each faction had its own interests. Queen Clemency herself was under immense pressure and constantly watched. Her every move was observed. Every sign of labor was reported. The entire court was in suspense, because this baby would decide not only who would be king, but the future of all of Europe. On the night of November 14th to 15th, 1316, it finally happened. A boy was born. Celebrations erupted throughout France. The kingdom had its legitimate king, who was immediately named John I. But here is the chilling detail. John I was just a crown prince waiting to grow up. Because his father had died before he was born, John was born king. He was the only French monarch to be king from the very first second of his life. The youngest king in French history. The bells of all the churches in Paris rang in celebration. Messengers ran across the French countryside, carrying the news. The male heir had arrived, the crisis was resolved, and the Capetian dynasty was secure. It was supposed to be the beginning of a glorious new reign. The nobles were already planning the presentation ceremony, where the little king would be shown to the most powerful barons in France. But something terrible was about to happen. Something no one expected. Philip, the regent, was present at all times. He visited the baby king constantly, oversaw his care, and controlled who had access to the little monarch. Too many. He was simply fulfilling his duty as uncle and protector. But some were already beginning to suspect. Just 5 days later, on November 20th, 1316, during the very ceremony of presentation, the impossible happened. The baby king died, suddenly, mysteriously, without clear explanation. The kingdom that had just celebrated its new monarch was now in total shock. The official version was vague, almost suspicious. Natural causes. But how could a baby healthy enough to be presented publicly die like that, out of nowhere, in a matter of days? Questions immediately began to circulate in the courts, castles, and taverns. Witnesses reported that the baby was fine in the morning, but suddenly began having seizures during the ceremony. Some said he turned purple, others that he stopped breathing without warning. Doctors were called urgently, but there was nothing they could do to save the little king. And here is where the story gets dark. Who stood to gain the most from the death of this baby? Exactly. Philip, the uncle regent, who immediately became King Philip V. Coincidence? History raises serious doubts about that. Philip wasted no time. As soon as John died, he quickly consolidated his power. He established the Salic law, which prohibited women from inheriting the French throne, ensuring that neither John's older sister nor any other woman could challenge him. This law was a brilliant and cruel move at the same time. With it, Philip not only secured his throne but also created a precedent that would last for centuries. The Salic law would become one of the most important rules of the French monarchy, and it all began with the convenient death of a baby. But suspicions about what really happened to John have never disappeared. Many historians believe the baby was poisoned. Others speak of suffocation or deliberate neglect. The fact is that his death was too convenient to be merely an accident. There are reports that the baby's wet nurse mysteriously disappeared soon after his death, that the doctors who attended to John were discreetly removed from the court, though witnesses who asked too many questions ended up silenced or exiled. All these details paint a very sinister picture. What makes it all the more sinister is that John I was buried quickly, almost hastily, in the Basilica of St. Denis. There's no autopsy, no real investigation. For a king of France, this was extremely unusual and suspicious. The funeral ceremony was discreet, almost secret. While other kings received grand funerals that lasted 4 days, John was buried in a matter of hours. It was as if the court wanted to forget he had ever existed as quickly as possible. The story of John I Hayes has practically disappeared from the records. While other French kings have monuments, statues, and pages of history dedicated to them, John is merely a footnote. 5 days of reign, but an eternity of mystery. Chronicles from the time were edited, documents disappeared, and contradictory accounts multiplied. It's as if there was a deliberate effort to erase John I from collective memory. And the more time passed, the easier it was to pretend he'd never existed. This episode completely changed the history of Europe. If John had survived, the line of succession would have been completely different. The 100 Years' War between France and England, which began decades later over succession issues, might never have happened. Think about it. Millions of lives lost in wars that lasted generations, all because a baby mysteriously died in 5 days. The entire history of Europe could have been different. Cities that were destroyed could still be standing. Dynasties that fell could have prospered. The Capetian dynasty continued with Philip V, but always carried the shadow of those 5 days. John I became a ghost in history, a king who existed, but whom many prefer to forget. Why? Because his story raises uncomfortable questions about power and ambition. Philip V reigned for 6 years, but his reign was marked by suspicion and whispers. Some nobles never accepted his legitimacy. Others kept their doubts silent. The stain of John's death never completely faded from Philip's reputation. Today, more than 700 years later, we still don't have definitive answers. John I's tomb in St. Denis exists, but few visit it. Few remember the infant king who could have changed everything, but whose life and reign were stolen before it even began. Modern historians have tried to investigate, but records are scarce and contradictory. Some argue it was indeed a natural death, while others firmly believe it was murder. The truth is probably buried with John in St. Denis, and we will never know for sure what happened at that fateful ceremony. Some say history is written by the victors, and Philip V was certainly a victor. But John I, the posthumous, deserved more than to be erased from memory. He deserved to be remembered as the youngest king of France, even if only for 5 days. This is the story that the House of Capet doesn't want you to know. A forgotten king, a mysterious death, and a crime that was never solved. John I, the posthumous, a king who reigned for 5 days and was condemned to oblivion by the very history that should have honored him.